My name is Don Hall, and in 1961, I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota majoring in finance, and that was so long ago there was no West Bank campus. Our classes were on the other side of the river. I had completed most of my coursework and I had to write a thesis in order to get the degree. And I did not have a good idea of what kind of a thesis to write. So my advisor suggested I go talk to Merrill Cohen, who was the head of the J.M. Dane brokerage firm in downtown Minneapolis, and see if he had any ideas. And I did that, and it was 1961. And Merrill Cohen said, I think this market we're in right here would make a good subject for a thesis. And he was talking about the Twin Cities local stock market. He said, all kinds of new companies are coming public. They're coming at crazy valuations. There's lots of enthusiasm. I'm curious to see how it all ends. Today we would call it a bubble, but we didn't have that word then. And then he said, control data started it all. And he said, I think that would be a good thesis. So, well, I agreed. I thought it was a good idea. But I was young. I had no concept of how to gather the information, how to compare one time versus another to measure the enthusiasm and so on. And I got married and I got a full-time job, and 50 years went by and I didn't write the thesis. But 5 years ago, I said, that's still a good idea. I think I should do that. Only I wrote it in the form of a book, not a thesis. And it was called Generation of Wealth. And what did I learn from that? Well, I learned that 50 years later, a good idea at one point, it can still be a good idea 50 years later, but the difference is much of the audience had died. So I don't want you to conclude, wait until you can see everything clearly, you got hindsight, before you do anything. That's not the message. There are a lot of interesting stories from that period. And let's begin with the first, Control Data Corporation. How many of you have heard of Control Data? Oh, most of you, that's good. Heard of it. Well, let me just give you a few details. Control Data was started in 1957. By a group of engineers who were working for Sperry Rand Univac. And they were very distressed with their work. They weren't getting proper attention from management, they weren't getting funding. They had to compete with another similar operation in Philadelphia. They knew there was a big opportunity and they didn't feel that they were able to grasp it like they should. The head of Sperry Rand had various computer operations combined in the Univac division. And the head of the Univac division was William Norris. You've heard of William Norris? Okay, good. In the early 1957, he was demoted. And then he decided to form a new company. And a bunch of engineers were very eager to join him. So they got together and they drew up a prospectus, 8 pages long, versus, 100 today? And they decided to sell stock to friends and relatives for $1 a share. And they went to the Securities Commissioner and they had to get approval for the prospectus. And he said, you're going to sell this yourself? You're not going to use an underwriter, not a brokerage firm? No, we're not going to. Well, I don't think you have a very good chance of success, but there's nothing illegal about it, so you can go ahead. But he said, I want the investors to sign a sheet of paper saying, there's no way to value this business. I still want to invest anyway. So they set about raising money at $1 a share, and within 2 months, they raised twice as much money as they anticipated, as described in the prospectus. They also said in the prospectus they did not want to compete with the major companies in the industry. They wanted to sell their services. They were a group of very talented engineers, and they hoped that they could design products for other companies. The stock was at $1 a share in 1957. By 1961, it was $100 a share. And that was what led to the great enthusiasm in the local market that Merrill Cohen was referring to, that he thought I should write a thesis about. Many, many new companies came public. Well, what made it go to $100 a share? As I said, they started out, they were going to be a group of engineers just selling their services. One of the engineers working there was Seymour Cray. You might have heard of him. Seymour Cray was, by virtually all accounts, a genius. Some say a savant, but he was of that caliber. And within a month or two after forming the corporation, he had a design concept for a new large-scale scientific computer. And Norris, who was the head of the organization, said, boy, I didn't know exactly what we were going to do when we started, but when Seymour came up with this idea, I thought, great, now we got something we can do. And they set about building that machine, and it was very successful. And that's why the stock went from $1 to $100 a share. Control Data went on, and it had certainly some ups and downs with economic conditions and so on. By the way, I'm measuring success by the stock value, and I'm not saying that's perfect, because we all know stocks can go to extremes one way or the other. But it is an objective measure of success in some ways. There were some splits along the way. In 1968, Control Data was selling at $174 a share, and that was its peak. And because of splits, people who had invested earlier now had stock worth 780 times their initial investment. That is, a $1,000 initial investment was now $750,000. And that was the peak. Because after that, things did not go nearly as well. They got into other product lines, they got into a lot of peripheral equipment, they got into dogfight competition in peripheral equipment. By 1974, the stock was below $10 a share, from 172 down to 10. It wasn't all their fault that it dropped to 10. There was a severe recession at that time. OPEC, the oil exporting nations, had instituted an embargo against the Western nations and Japan because they were upset by the wars in the Middle East. Israel, particularly, the U.S. supporting Israel, the Western countries. So the price of gasoline went straight up. I think it quadrupled. There was inflation all over. Everybody had to raise their prices. Interest rates went to 12%. Stocks went down to account for the fact that bonds all of a sudden were more attractive with a higher rate of interest. There are a lot of factors at work that caused that decline. But nonetheless, it was real, and if you're in business, you have to accept the fact these things can happen. The name Control Data is now gone. Much of its residual activity is still around. The Seagate operation out in Bloomington is the original Control Data disk drive operation. And Ceridian, which is also in Bloomington, is the ultimate residual of the major corporation. So that's a case of extraordinary success and then much difficulty after that, for reasons that weren't necessarily all theirs. Now, I mentioned Seymour Cray. He left Control Data in 1972, and he formed his own company called Cray Research. While he had been at Control Data, he had designed the initial product that was a great success. Then he designed the 6600, which was the first supercomputer. Then he designed the 7600, which was a follow-on supercomputer. So 3 times he had designed the world's most advanced computer. He started his own company, and he designed a product called the Cray 1, which again was the leading supercomputer in the world at that time, and the Cray 2. So this man 5 times had designed the world's leading computer. His stock, by which we're measuring success, I guess, at this moment, for this talk anyway, went up 120-fold in about 11 years. But then it began to falter. Things were changing. Seymour went on and started another company, Cray Computer. And by then, microprocessors were coming along. And you put enough small computers together in parallel, you can do parallel processing, you can do the work of a supercomputer at 1/10 the cost. And of course, networking. So you didn't need all the big memory because you can get memory from all other sources if you're networked. And Seymour started this company called Cray Computer, designed a machine. It would be his 6th supercomputer, and it failed. They got no customers. The company filed bankruptcy. So why do I bring that up? Well, you can be extraordinarily successful, you can be a genius, you can have everything go wonderfully, and still you might fail. And I don't mean to say that to instill fear, doubt, insecurity, to paralyze you, don't do anything. Just to be realistic that these things can happen, and as you've heard from many other speakers, know that they can happen and deal with them. Now there's another company that came out of that period. It was started in 1949. Two brothers-in-law decided to form a little company. It was sort of like a, let's do this sounds like it'd be fun. And they called it Medtronic. And they tinkered around, did work on medical products, fixing things and developing some things until about 1960. They didn't really have a clear business plan. They took on some other companies' products to distribute them as well. But because of the success of control data, went public in 1957. In 1960, Medtronic was able to raise money in the public market. And they did so. They raised $200,000, which they thought was a nice pot of money, and they opened a new corporate headquarters and so on. And by 1962, their bank was calling their loans. They cut back half of their product lines, discontinued them. They laid off half their employees. The two founders both went for a year without salary. They put the company up for sale. They had one offer, $3 a share, contingent on a study. So they hired Arthur D. Little, the preeminent consultant firm, and did a study, and Little said, we think there's a market for 10,000 pacemakers. Well, today, 400,000 are installed every year, pacemakers. We think there's a market for 10,000 pacemakers, and so the company said, they withdrew their offer. We're not going to go ahead. So Medtronic was left to die or figure something out. And the board of directors told Earl Bakken, the founder, either you have to get out of the lab and quit tinkering with machines, which is what he liked to do, he was an engineer, and become an executive, or find someone else to run the company. Well, he thought about it, he said, I'd like to become an executive. This is my baby, I'd like to make it work. And so he read everything he could on management, and he practiced public speaking, and he addressed the idea that he's got to make big decisions and speak strategically. Changed his clothes from work clothes at the lab and bought himself a suit and a tie and tried to look like an executive. Some friends invited him to play golf. He did that once, and they said, come back again, you're pretty good, dude. And they invited him a second time, and he said, no thanks, I've already done that. And we know, because it's here today, we know that he was transformed, he became a chief executive, and the company is the preeminent medical device company in the world today. So there is a case of moderate success, then near extinction, and tremendous follow-on success. Now, there's one other individual I'd like to refer to, a story that evolves out of this time. Medtronic had an employee named Manny Villafana. Have you heard of Manny Villafana? Raise your hand. I heard a couple, yeah. Oh, quite a few, that's good. Has he spoken here? Is that it? No? Well, let me give you Manny Villafana's story. His parents were Puerto Rican. They moved up to New York City in 1929, just as the Depression was started. They had no education and they did not know English. And they suffered a lot during the Depression. Had trouble putting food on the table for their family. Manny was born in 1940 in the South Bronx in New York. And he was an ambitious, bright kid. And through odd jobs and so on, he was able to put himself through, he went through high school, Cardinal Hayes High School in the South Bronx. It was a 4,000 all boys school, good rigorous academic program, and he was a good student. And he had enough money to pay for 1 year of college, which he did. And then he ran out of money. So he got jobs, various jobs. Each job he was learning something new, And he was working for Picker International, and he became a representative for medical products, talking to medical institutions around the world, sometimes direct to doctors, about medical products and how they're supposed to work and what the problems are, and if it doesn't work, send it back, and so on, as a typical representative of products. One of his products was pacemakers. So he came back to Minneapolis once or twice to try to learn all he could about pacemakers. It was Medtronic pacemaker, I should say. And there he was, talking to doctors around the world, explaining to them how to install a pacemaker and this and that, and he was 24 years old or something like that. Medtronic decided they wanted to go direct with their overseas sales. They didn't want to deal through Picker International anymore, and so they severed their relationship with Picker, and then asked themselves the question, now what are we going to do? Who are we going to sign up and to handle our overseas activities? And they hired Manny Villafana. So he came back to Minneapolis, working there for a while. He suggested that they look at other markets, and they said, well, go ahead, study them. So he said, how about South America? And they said, well, go ahead. And so he went down to Argentina, and he opened up the market, the whole South American market for Medtronic in Argentina. He was there for 2 years, but his son had severe allergies, and he had to leave that climate, came back to Minneapolis. Medtronic did not have a job for him, so he was out on his own. And he started a company called Cardiac Pacemakers. Now, the Medtronic pacemakers were mercury batteries, and Cardiac had lithium batteries. Much better improvement, much longer life. But it wasn't obvious at the time. The lithium wasn't a proven technology. Manny took a chance. He said, if I'm going to start a new company, it's got to be on something radically different. I got to have a pitch, an advantage to tell my customers if we're going to make this go. Cardiac pacemakers sold out, I think it was 6 years later, for 80 times the initial investment. It was a public company in Minneapolis, so a lot of the public got to participate in that. He liked to do entrepreneurial work. He didn't like to be an ongoing manager. He wasn't like Earl Bakken, who converted himself into a manager. So he started the second company. You may have heard of this, St. Jude Medical. And of course, it was dealing in heart valves. And of course, it was also very, very successful, and it continues on today. In fact, Medtronic and St. Jude Medical are two of the leading medical device companies in the world, and they're located right here in the Twin Cities. And their founders were essentially Earl Bakken and Manny Villafana. So Manny now had 2 successes. He started 5 more medical companies, none of which was much of a success. In fact, one of them, after a couple of years of dealing with the product, he said, we're going to liquidate the company, we're going to return whatever is left to the shareholders and call it a failure, which he did. So the lesson there, again, not to put fear in your minds, is that here is a man with extraordinary success. It'd be easy to follow him and say, oh, I'll just do whatever he does because he knows how to do it. Conditions change, and he had his failures as well. I think what had changed is that they're much more complicated bringing out medical products. They had to go through the FDA. You had to get reimbursement from Medicare. You had to prove your stuff. There was much more competition. There was price competition. All kinds of things had changed. So he did not have the success he had initially. Now, finished. Oh, my time's up. I was going to ask how much time I had left. My final comment from Manny Villafana. He was interviewed some years ago, and he said, the entrepreneur has to believe that within himself, he or she is a super person. If you don't have that spirit within you, there are just too many roadblocks, just too many things that won't allow you to get things done. If you feel you're the average Joe or the average Jane, it's not going to happen. And then he added, after a team is put together, the first big challenge is raising capital. So, that's his assessment, and I think he means by that, not that you're arrogant, and boastful, and proud, and obnoxious. He means a quiet confidence, an ability to know that the future is not quite knowable, but to be aware of that and therefore to prepare yourself to deal with whatever comes and to have that quiet confidence. Thank you.